Most of us have a very strong opinion about abortion. This video is going to show you just how baseless that opinion is.
Hey, thanks for making an introduction for me. I really hate this video, and I hate it possibly for the same reason I hate Stefan Ronny's introduction to philosophy videos, namely that he presents it as if it's going to be an objective assessment of different people's opinions and how things have developed over time, and instead it's just him presenting his opinion on a question and calling it an introduction to philosophy. Now in this case it's even worse though, because it says why you're wrong about abortion, which implies that it's going to focus on a mistake made equally by both sides. Like there's something that both people, regardless of their opinion, get wrong, and yet it never talks about why people who oppose abortion is wrong. All it talks about is why people who are in favour of abortion are wrong. And the arguments are terrible, so the fact that it's called Why You're Wrong About Abortion is not only stupid because it's not just talking to the general audience, it's talking to people who are for abortion, but secondly because it's not even close to proving anyone is against abortion, because it uses the same rehashed arguments we've heard a million times before. Now, if you want a wider understanding of my opinion on abortion, there is an hour and 20-minute video, which I will link to, where I present my positive argument for abortion, and I will be relating many of my points back to that, but I'll try not to repeat too much.
It's easy to pick a side and never reconsider it. We don't really like to think about heavy things. This is a disgrace to logic.
Fucking fuck. Jesus fucking Christ. Can you just be a little reasonable when you're addressing other people's ideas? Could you not just realise that people who are in favour of abortion have thought about it? Because you are just the worst. This is Julie Borowski levels of people who don't agree with me are just really dumb. And I don't know, maybe this girl is going to become the new Julie Borowski. I could easily imagine that happening. And God, would I just hate that.
Now, I won't be arguing whether abortion is okay based on religion, feminism, or what your president says. Abortion is a purely ethical issue.
Feminism and religion, of course, have nothing to do with ethics.
Does abortion equal the premeditative murder of an innocent human being? When does one become a human being?
So before we continue any further, it's worth noting that when she says the phrase, become a human being, she means get a significant value to your life that is worth considering and can be reasonably considered unethical to end. She doesn't mean human being in the sense of genetics or taxonomical classification. And I bring this up because it's pretty relevant later on.
Is a mentally delayed man not a person? Is someone in a coma not a person? Is a woman with Alzheimer's less of a person than she used to be?
In other words, it's going to become relevant right here. She's making the statement that if someone is or has a mental or physical defect, then they are less of a person, or she is implying that that's what other people are arguing. And she makes this sound absurd, but the argument isn't that someone is less of a person, the argument is that someone's life is less valuable if they have a mental or physical defect. And you might disagree with this, but if I put two people in front of you who were clones, and one of them had Alzheimer's, or one of them was in a coma, which they might never wake up from, or one of them was mentally disabled, would you make a choice about their quality of life and from that infer who you should kill? Because I realise some people wouldn't, but at the same time I don't think you can just dismiss the idea that lots of people, including me, would think, okay, I will kill the person who's less likely to have a decent quality of life. And that is the question. You know, it's not about whether or not someone is a person, it's about, when it comes down to it, who has the greater right to a decent quality of life, who is going to benefit more from having a decent quality of life. Questions like that are the questions we need to be addressing.
Is a 25-year-old more of a person than a 2-year-old?
This again alludes mostly to the video I made on abortion, where I made a large part covering this, but basically all I'm going to say is that I would consider someone to become more of a person as they develop their character and their ambitions and, yes, to a degree, their capacity to fend for themselves. And it's, you know, you don't become a person at a jump point, and as I said in my video, it's not just no person, no person, no person, person, it's person, 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 person. And yes, a 25-year-old man is more of a person than a 2-year-old. And this is just me, but if you put a 25-year-old man and a 2-year-old in front of me, I would shoot the 2-year-old, if I had to. Because the 2-year-old doesn't really have anything to them. They don't have a personality, really, probably. They don't have ambitions that can be considered realistic. They haven't worked very hard to get to the point they are. A 25-year-old man's put in 25 years of their life to get to where they are. I think, let them live out the rest of it. 2-year-old, you've wasted 2 years on something that, you know, I know that sounds callous, and it will sound hopefully less callous if you watch me discuss all the nuances of that for an hour and 20 minutes. I'm sorry for pimping this video so much, but it is sort of relatively important to understand my whole point on abortion. This is probably the last time I will discuss abortion, but yeah, I just thought I'd kind of give an overview of my opinions on abortion by discussing this video, so you don't necessarily need to watch that video, but if you're going to call me a psychopath for saying these things or something like that, then you should probably understand the nuance of it by watching that video, but if this is sufficient for you, then that's fine.
Oh, I got it. It depends on dependency, right? It's a burden, right? So you can justifiably flush it out like a parasite. Well, by that logic, you can get rid of 3-year-olds.
There are more things to consider here than just whether or not the child is valuable. And, you know, I mean, if you want to go back to basic ethics, it's like the trolley problem. Functionally speaking, flicking a switch to kill 5 people rather than, to kill 1 person rather than 5 people seems justified, and yet it is equivalent to killing 1 person to use their organs to save 5 people, and yet that doesn't seem justified. And this is because even though sometimes the results can be the same, the mechanism and the way with which these results are achieved are important. And in this case, killing a child can be considered more immoral than killing a fetus, even though the two are maybe functionally equivalent in terms of their consequentialist ethical value, because we would seriously question the character of someone who would kill a child, whereas an abortion is a medical procedure.
But then what about if it's like halfway out of the mother? What if it's born but still attached to the umbilical cord?
What? I don't know, I mean, she admits that this is getting laughable, which is, I guess, to her credit. But at the same time, arbitrary distinctions are only important if you believe that there is not a continuous growth of the value being discussed. I mean, I'm trying to think of a good example of this, but you know, if let's imagine for a moment that being cool or being a nerd is defined by how much science you know, and yet they're considered to be 2 different categories, well then you've got a problem, because you can know varying degrees of science, and the question is at which point do you become a nerd. But obviously being cool or being a nerd isn't defined by how much science you know, but this is just my ad hoc analogy. But what if you say that you can be more of a nerd or more of a cool person, like you can have, you know, varying degrees of knowledge in science? Well, then you don't have a contradiction at all. And likewise, if you say that you become more valuable as a human being as time goes on, then the fact that there are abrupt moments where you can argue that something significant happens that changes the state of a person doesn't actually have any effect at all, because we're not talking about sudden jumps or anything like that.
There are currently 3 countries that allow abortion up to the moment of birth: China, North Korea, and Canada. Yes, peace-loving Canada only defines you as a human being once you have fully exited the birth canal.
So obviously the argument here is supposed to be that Canada is just as bad as North Korea because of their abortion laws, which is really fucking dumb, because lots of countries are similar to North Korea in some ways. Doesn't mean that they are just as bad as North Korea. Also, and this is something that really gets on my nerves, when someone tries to point out a contradiction in, and I've mentioned it before, someone tries to point out a contradiction in someone's positions by, for example, saying, peace-loving Canada says this about abortion, and they're trying to show that Canada isn't peace-loving, but maybe they're showing, you know, the opposite, which is that a country can be peace-loving and still have those abortion laws. Maybe that's the reality of the situation. If it's possible for a country that is, you know, relatively progressive like Canada to have abortion laws like that, then maybe it suggests that abortion laws are, or very lax abortion laws are completely compatible with being a progressive country.
A woman that carries a fetus for 9 months and then gets an abortion the day before delivery has done nothing wrong. But a woman who has a baby prematurely and then stabs it shortly after its birth has committed murder.
Again, the whole virtue ethics thing about how killing a fetus is just fundamentally a different process to stabbing a baby. I would have thought it was obvious. But the other thing is that the state and laws are not ethically perfect, because ethics is complicated, and ethics usually does involve scales and things like that. Laws fit roughly onto the sort of scales we establish for ethics, but that doesn't mean that they are going to always fit perfectly. And the fact that laws may seem to be inconsistent or confusing does not change or make the ethical idea behind that law bad. It just means that the ethical law doesn't lend itself to a perfect state law, which is almost to be expected with the majority of ethical ideas.
So maybe we become human at some crucial stage of development. When is this magical moment?
There isn't a magical moment where people become human. It's a continuous process.
Human life begins at conception. The zygote contains all the necessary material for a human being. So how is it not a human being?
Nobody said it wasn't a human being. You're doing that thing, which I keep telling people not to do. Don't define human being in strictly scientific terms and then act as if you've proven that it is ethically valuable. Because you're not doing that. You're just proving that it is a human in strictly scientific terms.
It is the only unarbitrary way to define when a human life begins.
Scientifically, yes, but I thought you were talking about ethics, in which case you have to address the reality that the main argument in favour of abortion has nothing to do with whether or not the fetus is alive. You know, the idea that something isn't valuable, or that something's life isn't ethically valuable and therefore we should kill it, doesn't exist. The argument is that something's life doesn't outweigh ethically the value of a woman's right to autonomy, or the value of people to direct their own lives without having to be obligated to care for children that they didn't want. That's the argument you're up against, not the argument that children aren't valuable, therefore we should kill them.
Therefore, abortion is always morally wrong.
Brilliant.
Is that it's way easier to empathize with a grown woman than a zygote, embryo, or fetus.
She prefaces this by saying that this is what logical people think, which I find peculiar because she then frames it as if being or taking this position that we should care more about a grown woman than we should about a fetus is because of some inability to empathize with a fetus, which is not the case.
We use language. A happy expectant mother uses words like baby and miracle, but if the pregnancy is unwanted, we use terms like cluster of cells, blob, parasite.
I hate when people bring up semantics in abortion debates, but just as an aside, I don't think people use that term when the pregnancy is unwanted. People use that term when discussing abortion. Although I don't think very many people actually use the term cluster of cells. But if a woman has an unwanted pregnancy, I don't think she's likely to refer to it as a cluster of cells. She's more likely to refer to it as an unwanted pregnancy, which is arguably still using semantics, but I just think it's worth noting that, I don't know, like, since when did pregnant women say, oh, I've got a cluster of I've got a cluster of cells. Oh, fuck, gonna have to have an abortion. Yay! I love killing babies.
And if you do attribute more value to a more developed being, then you have to make peace with the fact that a 10-year-old is less valuable than a 70-year-old.
Yeah, sure. Seems reasonable. No, but seriously, I don't think, I mean, again, the point I make in my actual video on abortion is that the value of life drops off after you've lived more of your life, because then you've sort of got your life. You know, I define it as you develop as a person, it increases, and as you live out your life as a person and, you know, start to get benefits and things like that, and live the normal human life, it gets less and less valuable. Now, I'd say the point at which I could say that someone dying isn't a big deal is around the age of 95. I think earlier than that, I think it was a bit rubbish. Now, I don't know whether or not I'd say a 70-year-old is more valuable than a 10-year-old, but I would say that a 20-year-old is more valuable than a 10-year-old, because a 20-year-old is in the middle of university and actually doing things that are hard work in order to advance their life and, you know, have a better quality of life. A 10-year-old isn't really doing any of those things. So, again, I mean, as always, the question, I do find these scenarios useful. Maybe it's just me, because the idea of, if you want to assess value of life, imagine two people in front of you and you have to shoot one of them. Because a lot of people talk about the value of life and they just automatically default to, oh, all life's equally valuable, but the question of which life is more valuable is a question of, if I put you in a room and there was a gun in that room and I told you you have to shoot one of two people, then there are a lot of things I could tell you that I almost have no doubt would affect who you decide to shoot. And if you think that no matter what you wouldn't have an opinion on that, that's fine. If you think that nothing makes one person more expendable or, you know, more worthy of life than another, then I'm not going to argue with you on that. But the point is that it isn't a crazy notion that this is the case. And yeah, if you put a 10-year-old and a 20-year-old in the same room, chances are I'd shoot the 10-year-old, because the 20-year-old has actually done more things and put in more effort.
We also rationalize with things like women's rights. I used to subscribe to this argument when I was like 15 and my brain was still developing and stuff.
It's a good thing that now you're so intellectually developed, because it's hilarious.
But abortion has nothing to do with women's rights. It's purely a moral issue.
Given that it's of no ethical consequence whether or not this woman is allowed to vote or express her opinion in public, perhaps it's reasonable that she not be allowed to do those things, because apparently women's rights is no longer a moral issue.
But some women aren't fit to raise a child. They're not ready. They're too young. No, they don't want to raise a child.
I would say not wanting to raise a child is a pretty clear indication that you aren't fit to raise a child. If you're going into parenthood thinking, oh, this is going to suck dick, then you're probably going to be not the best parent. When I have children, which I am actually hoping to have children, it's going to be in a situation where I can dedicate a large amount of time to being an actual parent, not when I have to balance it with other things that I have to do in order to ensure that I have a decent quality of life and my child has a decent quality of life. You know, it's not a selfish act, and she says it's a selfish act loads of times, but it's not. It's wanting to raise a child in the best environment that you can raise a child, which is an entirely selfless act. If my partner got pregnant, I would want her to have an abortion, and I think she would want to have an abortion. Although, you know, just to give you an insight into my domestic life, we've only discussed this peripherally, but not because we want to kill that child, but because we want a future child to have a better life. How is that selfish?
And some people plan to have children and end up being terrible parents.
So this is probably the only actual argument that's really made in this video. And it's still not that great, because even if people plan on doing something and then aren't very good at it, I don't see how that's an argument that we should force people who don't plan on doing something and will not be very good at it into doing it. In fact, we shouldn't force people who don't plan on doing something and will be very good at doing it into doing it. Because we shouldn't force people into doing anything like that. We shouldn't force people to carry children in their wombs for 9 months, I don't think.
But if a woman is financially insecure, surely she shouldn't be bringing a kid into a world of poverty. People raise kids with zero money all over the world.
Sure, you can raise a child if you're in desperate poverty, but the point is, if we live in a society where people can make a better life for themselves, why not allow those people to make a better life for themselves and then raise children? Why say that 16-year-olds should raise children and forego all the things that would make their life and their child's life better because this child was accidentally born first or conceived first?
A woman should not have to go through scrutiny when choosing to terminate an early stage pregnancy that was caused by rape. Yet she should still go through a mourning process and understand that this was not her right, it was a choice.
If it was her choice, then it was also her right to do it. If you have a choice to do something, then in the strictest sense you do also have a right to do that thing. Because if you didn't have a right to do that thing, then you wouldn't be able to do that thing. So I'm not even sure what you're arguing here. I think you're just failing to grasp basics of legal terms. It's worth noting that this girl identifies herself as an anarcho-capitalist. She has about 10,000 subscribers, which means she's on her way to becoming one of the voices for anarcho-capitalism. And I'm really not sure how I feel about that, because this video was really, really funny. So maybe it will be a good thing. I can't really tell. She doesn't annoy me as much as Julie Borowski does. So, I mean, I've pretty much got no doubt that she will annoy me as much as Julie Borowski does if I have to see much more of her content.